But I can't get it. I can't remember it. And it blows
I
so
didn't get the
perfect.
shofar now.
He said that wasn't Danny.
He said it's not Danny.
He said he ruined it when he had his first practice one. I always forget the. He said he blew it beautiful
blow
in the
it?
practice. It was so beautiful, Dennis said.
Well, y'all realize we are recording, right?
No.
No, he didn't say that.
Well, I've been trying to tell everybody that I'm turning these things on.
Sure, he gives me the
People don't
look,
want to listen.
and you guys get nothing.
Are you ready? Blessed are you, Yahweh Eloheinu, King of the universe, who has commanded us to hear and respond to the call of the shofar.
See, you being off 6 really helped you, buddy. You really put it out there.
We're taking, guys.
Does that make you feel good? Okay. Book of Esther, if y'all will turn to the book of Esther. We, and nobody brought no groggers, right? All right. I don't know how many of you have really looked at how many have studied, how many have ever really heard the teaching. I know some have heard it many, many times, and you know, but it gets kind of interesting each time and over again. And if you'll notice there in the book of Esther, in verse 1, it said, "Now it came to pass in the days of," and that name there, if you really pronounce it correctly in the Hebrew, it is Achashverosh. Okay? Not Ahaz uterus, or whatever that looks like it says. Ahaz uterus, uterus. Okay. But it's Achashverosh. And you'll notice that it's in parentheses in these next few words. It says, "Now this was the Achashverosh who reigned from India to Ethiopia over 127 provinces." Now these words in parentheses indicate a very special king. There were others who had become, you know, the king of the Medes and the Persians. They had the same name called Achashverosh. It's more like a title than it is a name, okay? And in the book of Daniel, we're told in chapter 5 that the kingdom of Babylon was taken over by Darius the Mede. You know, he was, you know, the Medes and the Persians was one kingdom. At that time, the Medes and the Persians were joined into one empire. So over time, Cyrus the Persian became the king. And then 2 Chronicles chapter 36, go with me to that. We'll look at verse 22 and 23. I think it helps us if we can begin to put these books in the context, you know, of where, you know, where they belong in chronological order. 2 Chronicles chapter 36. People don't realize the Chronicles got 36 chapters. And in verse 22 and 23. They said, "Now in the first year of Cyrus, king of Persia, that the word of Yahweh by the mouth of Jeremiah or Jeremiah might be fulfilled, Yahweh stirred up the spirit of Cyrus, the king of Persia, so that he made a proclamation throughout all his kingdom and also in writing, saying." Now, in the scripture, this is telling us that this particular word that came from Cyrus is the one that was especially designed for Yahweh's word to be fulfilled. A lot of people out there argue which king it was, you know, and Daniel talks about from the time the going forth of the word to rebuild Jerusalem. And this tells us that this was that word. This is the Cyrus king that Yehoshua chose, you know, to issue the proclamation. In verse 23, it says, "Thus says Cyrus, the king of Persia, all the kings of the earth, Yahweh, the Elohim of heaven, has given me, and he has commanded me to build him a house or a temple at Jerusalem, which is in Judah. Who is there among you of all his people? May Yahweh, his Elohim, be with him, and let him go up." So Cyrus is not only issuing the decree to rebuild it, but he's calling for the people that are willing to go and to help rebuild this thing. I think it's kind of an interesting thought. This is the one that talks about in Daniel chapter 11, you know, when from the time the decree goes, it'll be like, you know, 490 years or 483 years until Messiah will be cut off. So when we look at that, then Cyrus the Persian became king, and then that one tells us that Cyrus, told by Yahweh to build or to rebuild the temple. And during the first year of his reign, he made a proclamation concerning the return of the people to Jerusalem or to Jerusalem. Now the books of Ezra and Nehemiah record the details of the return of those people after the 70-year captivity in Babylon. Okay? Now remember when Babylon, lost it, and then the Medes and the Persians became, leaders over it and everything, so that's when this thing came in. Now the book of Esther actually seems to fit between chapters 6 and 8 of the book of Ezra. If you want to kind of make yourself a little note to read the first, 6 chapters of Ezra, and then go read the book of Esther again, and come back and pick up and finish 7 and 8, I think you'll find how, Esther fits right in that chronological order. The book of Ezra covers from approximately 538 BC down to 437 BC, or 457 BC, okay?
Esther, did you say?
The book of Ezra covers from 538 to 457 BC. You're counting down like from 500 and then 400 and then 300 and 200 down to 0, and then you start counting up the other way when we get to that point. So Ezra covers 538 to 457, and the book of Esther covers approximately 10 years in there from 483 to 473 BC. Now the name Ahasuerus is Hebrew. His name, the Greek, is Xerxes, X-E-R-X-E-S, Xerxes. His Persian name would be Kshayash. Now this king, according to history, ruled from 456 to 464 BC, which is about, according to history, this thing all matches, about in that time. Can't give you exact dates, but I'm just saying, comparing everything in history and research, it all seems to mesh into that time, so it brings it down to that time frame in Ezra. We'll see in here, Esther was born of the tribe of Benjamin, okay? And she was born in captivity in Babylon. Her family did not return to Jerusalem after the decree of Cyrus. The name Esther is a Greek name, and it means star, from the Greek word stara, Esther, stara. I don't know how many of you are familiar with the Masonic, Masonic Lodge and all this kind of stuff, but the female counterpart of Masonic Lodge is known as Eastern Star. And this Eastern Star, when the women go into it, there's a seat that they call of Esther. When the Eastern Star is referring to her, that's what it's talking about, okay?
Her Hebrew name is Hadassah. Right?
Excuse me?
Her Hebrew name is
Yeah,
Hadassah.
the Hebrew name is Hadassah, which means myrtle. But the Persian name is Sitareh, and then the star in the Persian culture was considered an emblem of beauty. Now this star being considered an emblem of beauty, when we go back in Persia, and we go back now to India and all these kind of people, India, Iran, all these things, and we see them today, and we see all these women with these little marks, that sometimes they put a little stone or a gem or something on their forehead or a mark or something like that. This all goes back to the emblem of the star, this mark, which is considered a mark of beauty. People don't realize what they see today in everyday culture, how far back it goes and how many seat or origins it has in different pagan cultures and pagan religions. Now everybody loves a love story.
What does Ashtarosh mean? What's that in Hebrew?
Ahasuerus, we'll get to it here in just a minute, okay? But everybody loves a story about a king and a beautiful bride. This was probably the basis for the story of Cinderella, the rise of a girl from ashes, to become queen of a great king. But the real story in the book of Esther is the same story that's given to us in pages of Scripture over thousands of years. It's a story of redemption, okay? And that's what permeates everything from Genesis to Revelation. It's a story that we also have elements here of prophecy in this book pointing to the ultimate redemption of the chosen people. The story begins with a feast given by the king. Now, before we start reading here again, go with me to the parable that Messiah told in Matthew 22, in verse 1. And in verse 1 it says, And Yehoshua answered and spoke to them again by parables and said, The kingdom of heaven is like a certain king who arranged a marriage for his son. Notice he's saying the kingdom of heaven, and now he's giving you a parable, a story which reflects back on that. And he sent out his servants to call those who were invited to the wedding, and they were not willing to come. Again he sent out other servants, saying, Tell those who are invited, See, I have prepared my dinner. My oxen and fatted cattle are killed, and all things are ready. Come to the wedding. But they made light of it and went their ways, one to his own farm, another to his business, and the rest seized his servants, treated them spitefully or insolently, and killed them. But when the king heard, he was furious, and he sent out his armies, destroyed those murderers, and burned up their city. You see, the first ones that were called weren't worthy, so they were destroyed. And then he went out and made a second call, and now he's calling. He's looking for those who are considered worthy. Then he said to his servants, The wedding is ready, but those who were invited were not worthy. Therefore go into the highways, and as many as you find, invite to the wedding. You see, that's why New Testament also tells us many were called, but few are deemed worthy. Now it says few chosen, but it means deemed worthy. It's the same thing. So those servants went out into the highways and gathered together all whom they found, both bad and good. The wedding was filled with guests. But when the king came in to see the guests, he saw a man there who did not have on a wedding garment. So he said to him, Friend, how did you come in here without a wedding garment? He was speechless. Then the king said to the servants, Bind him hand and foot, take him away and cast into outer darkness. There will be weeping and gnashing of teeth, for many are called, but few chosen. And that word chosen there really means, but few are deemed worthy, which it goes back at the beginning. That's why he killed the first ones. They weren't worthy. So go back now, as we go back into Esther. Now I said there's elements in the book also which show blessings being given based on righteousness or obedience to Torah. I'm going to point out a couple of those things. We'll look at that and see what the scripture says about it, and then we'll see what it says in real life today and what people say. After all, nobody can afford to rat on Buddy, right? And all this kind of thing. Nobody's going to be a snitch or a squealer or a stool pigeon or whatever they want to call them today. But the outline of the prophetic element, the outline, okay? The king represents the Father Creator. Okay? And the name Achashverosh, which is the title, means I will be silent and poor.
Number 325.
Yeah. But of course, now he represents the Father Creator in this particular story. Now remember, these are symbolisms, not exact, okay? If they were exact, they'd be the real thing, not a sign, okay? But remember, Messiah came, who is Yahweh in the flesh, right? And he said he took upon himself no reputation. He gave up all his power. He became poor for our sake, right? And then it said that he held his peace, like a lamb led to slaughter. Didn't say nothing. So this Achashverosh means I will be silent and poor. I think that's kind of an interesting concept when you put the two together. Esther, of course, represents the bride, who is the star. Mordecai represents the Messiah. Haman represents the adversary, and then Haman's sons, the 10 sons, represent the kings who will be joined with the false Messiah in these latter days. The story is told with correlation of dates in the text, which point to the understanding of certain days given as the appointed times of Yahweh. In this particular instance, we're going to be talking about Passover and the Feast of Unleavened Bread. And then in verse 2, in those days when King Achashverosh sat on the throne of his kingdom, which was in Shushan, the citadel, that in the 3rd year of his reign he made a feast for all his officials and servants, the powers of Persia and Media, the nobles and the princes of the province before him, when he showed the riches of his glorious kingdom and the splendor of his excellent majesty for many days, 180 days in all. That's 6 months. Okay, 30 days in a month. That's a 6-month feast. Okay, that he gave for the whole 127 provinces. Is that what he said? And you notice it's in the 3rd year of his reign that he gave this feast. In the 3rd year of his reign. Then in verse 5, and when these days were completed, the king made a feast lasting 7 days for all the people who were present in Shushan, at the citadel or the palace, from great to small, in the court of the garden of the king's palace. in the court of the garden of the king's palace. So this was a feast for 7 days. And verse 6, were white and blue linen fastened with cords of fine linen and purple on silver rods and marble pillars. You know, the other day when we were looking at all these different things and how we looked at the white linen and the word for that and the marble, it can be the same thing, and then the blue, the tekelet and so forth, we see all these colors again in this wedding ceremony. And if we take that back, you can correlate that back to the Song of Solomon, you know, when it talks about the palanquin, the chair that Solomon made and the bride was riding in. All those colors again are involved again. The couches were of gold and silver on a pavement of alabaster, turquoise, and white and black marble. And they served drinks in golden vessels, each vessel being different from the other, with royal wine in abundance according to the generosity of the king. You know, if you make, you know, a couple of thousand different gold goblets and each one different from the other, that's got to be handmade. Those are expensive. That's not like turning them out, you know, in a factory, 100,000 the same kind. According to the generosity of the king, in accordance with the law, the drinking was not compulsory. For so the king had ordered all the officers of his household that they should do according to each man's pleasure. If he wanted to, he could. If he didn't want to, he didn't have to. Verse 9, Queen Vashti also made a feast for the women in the royal palace belonging to King Ahasuerus. Now Vashti, the word itself is the number 2060, and the word itself means beautiful. So Queen Vashti, or the beautiful queen. On the 7th day, when the heart of the king was merry with wine, he commanded Mehuman, Biztha, Harbonah, Bigtha, Abagtha, Zethar, and Carcas, 7 eunuchs who served in the presence of King Ahasuerus, to bring Queen Vashti before the king with the royal crown. A lot of Bibles have the word wearing in there, but that's not in the text. Okay? And there's a lot of myths and stories out there. Oh, he ordered to come wearing the crown and nothing else, and that's why she refused. Okay? Those are mythological stories that are not backed up by text. He just wanted to come, you know, in all of her beauty with the crown on and show off all her beauty to the whole court. But she refused, right? She rebelled against his order. You might say the first bride there was in rebellion against what the king said there. The first ones that Yahweh chose rebelled, right? So he divorced them. And then he said, I'll replace you. So he went out now and he's trying to get a replacement. And it's all those who are deemed worthy. If the first one was divorced for disobedience, you think he's going to stick another one in there and then let her do anything they want to do? If he divorced the children of Israel for disobedience, you think he's going to bring in a bunch of Gentiles and tell them they don't have to follow that law? That doesn't make sense, does it? Verse 12, but Queen Vashti refused to come at the king's command by his eunuchs. Therefore the king was furious and his anger burned within him. Verse 13, then the king said to the wise men who understood the times, for this was the king's manner toward all who knew law and justice, those closest to him being Karshina, Shethar, Admatha, Tarshish, Merez, Marsina, and Memucan, the 7 princes of Persia and Media, who had access to the king's presence and he ranked highest in the kingdom. And he asked the question, what shall we do to Queen Vashti according to law? The word law there is 1881. It's the word doth, D-A-W-T-H, meaning the royal edicts. So what shall we do to Queen Vashti according to the royal edicts of the king, because she did not obey the command of King Ahasuerus, brought to her by the eunuchs or the chamberlains, the ones who were in charge of the harem. And Memucan answered before the king and the princes, Queen Vashti has not only wronged the king, but also all the princes and all the people who are in all the provinces of King Ahasuerus. Now the queen in her rebellion brings harm to all the people who follow her example. You know, if she can rebel against the king's word and get away with it, and everybody else think, well, I can rebel against the husband's word and get away with it. Where do you think the destruction of the family started? Goes all the way back. And now we have people in families who really don't understand their place or what they're supposed to do. And I'm not trying to say that one's, you know, is in any lower position. I'm trying to say that the role each person has in the family is important, but it's different. We all have a different role, even though they have equal importance. Now, anyone or any group who teaches rebellion or rejection of the word of Yahweh is in the same category as this Queen Vashti. Verse 17, for the queen's behavior will become known to all women, so that they will despise their husbands in their eyes when they report, King Ahasuerus commanded Queen Vashti to be brought in before him, but she did not come. This very day the ladies of Persia and Media will say to all the king's officials that they have heard the behavior of the queen, thus there will be excessive contempt and wrath. Starting at verse 19, from this point on, she's never referred to as Queen Vashti. In the text, it's just Vashti. Whatever she was, she ain't no more. She lost it. She's even banned from the presence of the king. Her position is given to another better than she. As we read these words, think about what happened between King Saul and King David. You know, he said, it's been taken away from you and given to another better than you. Verse 19, if it pleases the king, let a royal decree go out from him, and let it be recorded in the laws of the Persians and the Medes, so that it will not be altered, that Vashti, no longer Queen Vashti, but Vashti, shall come no more before King Ahasuerus, and let the king give her royal position to another who is better than she. When the king's decree, which he will make, is proclaimed throughout all his empire, for it is great, then all wives will honor their husbands, both great and small. And the reply pleased the king and the princes, and the king did according to the word of Memucan. Then he sent letters to all the king's provinces, to each province in its own script, and to every people in their own language, that each man should be master in his own house and speak the language of his own people. The word of the king went out to all the people, each in their own language. Kind of like the same thing that happened back on Mount Horeb when the Torah was given. The same thing that happened when the word came, at the Feast of Shavuot or Pentecost in Acts chapter 2, and everybody heard the words of Yahweh in their own language. But in both instances, it's referring to the words, the law that was issued by the king. Okay. Chapter 2, it said, after these things, see that we went through that chapter real quick, didn't we? When the wrath of King Ahasuerus subsided, he remembered Vashti, what she had done and what had been decreed against her. Then the king's servants who attended him said, let beautiful young virgins be sought for the king. That word virgins there in verse 2 is the number 1330. It's the Hebrew word Bethulah, B-E-T-H-O-O-L-A-W, Bethulah. Some people say Betula, and I think we have an English word, Betula and Bethula and so forth. And it means a virgin from her privacy as being separated, okay, where she had no contact with anybody else. Now there's another word that's also translated virgin in the Hebrew text, Numbers 59:59, and it's the word Alma. We've heard this one before, where many people argue about what it is and what it isn't, and from Isaiah's prophecy about the virgin. And that word Alma means a lass as veiled or in privacy. So the meaning of the two words is the same, okay? Even though there might be two different, Hebrew words. In Genesis 24, in verse 16 and 43, both words are used to describe Rebekah, But now in verse 16 of Genesis 24, additional words were added with this word Bethulah, and it means neither had any man known her. So there are additional words which are used with that one to describe the virgin, okay? You don't describe who and what she is. Now in verse 3 there, chapter 2, it says, and let the king appoint officers in all the provinces of his kingdom, that they may gather all the beautiful young virgins to Shushan the citadel, into the women's quarters under the custody of Haggai, the king's eunuch, the custodian of the women, and let beauty preparations be given. Then let the young woman who pleases the king be queen instead of Vashti. This thing pleased the king, and he did so. Now in verse 5 it says, now in Shushan, the citadel, there was a certain Yehudi. The word Jew here is actually the Hebrew word Yehudi. And it's kind of a form from Yehudah, but it's actually referring to the people of the land. When all of them, Israel had been cast out of the land, a couple hundred years before Judah went into captivity. And then when Judah went into captivity, after 70 years, when they came back, they began to be called Yehudi, which is referring to the people of the land. So that all the people that came back, don't make any difference what tribe they were from, they were called Yehudi. Today we think of that as a term Jew, and everybody thinks, well, Jew comes from the tribe of Judah. But not all of those people over there are from the tribe of Judah, even though the term Yehudi is used. So people think of it as being from that one tribe, and it's a misnomer, it's not true. Of Mordecai, which is a number, there was a certain Yehudi whose name was Mordecai, the son of Yair, the son of Shimei, the son of Kish, a Benjamite. Remember, Shaul was a Benjamite also. And then the Apostle Paul was a Benjamite. And the name Mordecai means little man or worshiper of Mars, depending on which.
Worshiper of Mars.
Of Mars. The number's 4782. Okay? Go with me to 1 Samuel. In 1 Samuel, in chapter 10, in verse 19, he said, "But you have today rejected your Elohim, who himself saved you out of all your adversities and your tribulations, and you have said to him, No, but set a king over us. Now therefore present yourselves before Yahweh by your tribes and by your clans." And when Samuel had caused all the tribes of Israel to come near, the tribe of Benjamin was chosen. When he had caused the tribe of Benjamin to come near by their families, the family of Matri was chosen. And Shaul the son of Kish was chosen, but when they sought him, they could not be found. Therefore they inquired of Yahweh further, Has a man come here yet? And Yahweh answered, There he is, hidden among the equipment. So they ran and brought him from there, and when he stood among the people, he was taller than any of the people from his shoulders upward. This was a big man, and he was hiding when they tried to, get him out to anoint him as king. And Samuel said to all the people, Do you see him whom Yahweh has chosen, that there is no one like him among all the people? So all the people shouted and said, Long live the king. But I'm just going through this because it shows he was a descendant of Kish, the same as over here, Mordecai was a descendant of Kish. And in verse 7, or in 6, it said that the word Kish is in there in verse 6, had been carried away, but it's actually meaning who, referring to that family, who had been carried away from Jerusalem with the captives who had been captured with Jeconiah, the king of Yehuda, whom Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, had carried away. You see how this all fits in then with Babylon, and then after that captivity, Babylon had been captured by the Medes and the Persians. Now we're down to Cyrus, the one who issued the decree to return. All fits in with the order of it. And Mordecai had brought up Hadassah, which means myrtle, that is, Esther, his uncle's daughter, for she had neither father nor mother. The young woman was lovely and beautiful. When her father and mother died, Mordecai took her as his own daughter. The number for Hadassah is 1919, which is the Hebrew word for myrtle. Verse 8, So it was when the king's command and decree were heard, and when many young women were gathered at Shushan the citadel, in the custody of Hegai, that Esther also was taken to the king's palace into the care of Hegai, the custodian of the women. I want to make a mention of a couple of words. We're gathered, or gathered together in verse 8. I don't know what your translation says. We're gathered together, whatever it was. The number is 6908, and the Hebrew word is the word kabatz, meaning to seize, or to grab hold of, or grasp, or collected. Okay? Which gives you the impression this was something that's forced on them. It wasn't something that they volunteered to do. And then 6908, yes. And then the word they were taken to the king's palace, and that word taken, or some Bibles have the word brought, is the number 3947, lachach. Like L-A-Q-U-A-C-H, lachach. Literally it means to take, to be captured, to be taken away, to be removed, to be brought, to seize. When you look at these then in context, it seems that it was not a voluntary thing that these women did. They just went and gathered them up and took them whether they wanted to go or not.
What number was that?
That was 3947. And if you go back up and look at verse 3 again up there, okay, and the command that comes, it says, And let the king appoint officers in all the provinces of the kingdom, that they may gather or collect all the beautiful young virgins. Okay? All right. Now in verse 9 it says, Now the young woman pleased him, and she obtained his favor, so he readily gave beauty preparation to her, besides her allowance. Then 7 choice maidservants were provided for her from the king's palace, and he moved her and her maidservants to the best place in the house of the women. she's finding favor in the eyes of these men. You know, for whatever reason, that's happening. You'll notice as we go through here that nowhere in this whole book is the name of Yahweh or anything else ever mentioned. So in verse 10, Esther had not revealed her people or her kindred, for Mordecai had charged her not to reveal it. I guess there's times when it's, you know, keep your mouth shut is the best avenue, you know. And every day Mordecai paced in front of the court of the women's quarters to learn of Esther's welfare and what was happening to her. Each young woman's turn came to go in to King Ahasuerus after she had completed 12 months preparation according to the regulation for the women,